the launch of the 2017 update of the Global MPI. It is also International Day of Children in some countries. And so we celebrate that with the focus on children later today. The Global Multidimensional Poverty Index measures acute poverty in developing countries in a way that has the same structure of variables, a very limited set of variables, but the same structure across countries, so they can be compared insofar as is possible, given the data that we have. And we developed it in collaboration with the Human Development Report Office of UNDP for their 20th anniversary in 2010, and we now update it twice a year. What we will present is a little bit of the findings and some of the policy angles. But if you are a data geek, then the data tables are online. If you'd like more case studies from Ecuador or from other things, then we have more qualitative case studies online. The full PDFs of the policy briefings are there also. If you're interested in a particular country, there are country briefings, and there are also interactive data bank if you'd like to visualize. So I know some of you are coming back for the MPhil anniversary, but you still may be engaged in different ways. So please do explore the website and use the materials there insofar as they're useful. This is an international, very structured, very fixed measure. Many countries are using national MPIs that are tailored to their context with different indicators, different dimensions that reflect their national objectives. And those complement this quite limited measure. But while the measure has been constant now since 2010, what has changed is the context. So with the Sustainable Development Goals, it is now recognized that we are addressing poverty in all its forms and dimensions, that one of those is extreme income poverty, measured by the $1.90 a day, but that multidimensional poverty as a measure is vital. It's vital to capture what poor people experience. It's vital to direct integrated and multi-sectoral policies, and also to leave no one behind. We have to look into the overlapping deprivations that they experience. The other way that the context has changed is, in a sense, in the emerging consensus with other institutions. So OPHI's late and very beloved advisor, Sir Tony Atkinson, chaired a commission for the World Bank monitoring global poverty, which launched in October 2016. And that commission recommended that henceforth the World Bank monitor global poverty using monetary and non-monetary indicators. And furthermore, that it develop a multidimensional poverty indicator using our counting approach. And those recommendations have been accepted by the World Bank. So we are at a time when the policy environment, the attitudes towards multidimensional poverty, the recognition is shifting rapidly. If only the reality of multidimensional poverty were shifting that rapidly. The Global MPI is the work of many people, most of all of Gisela Robles Aguilar, who has directed not one, not two, but 3 Global MPIs. And she is fundamentally responsible for all of the quality and the work that we have. But there are many different people involved at different levels, and we're deeply grateful to this, and we recognize that it's a team project, and no one of us could do it alone. So what is the structure? Many of you know it, but there are 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standards equally weighted. There are 10 indicators equally weighted within dimensions. You're deprived if any member of your household is malnourished, or if a child has died. You're deprived if no member of your household has completed 5 years of schooling, or if a child is not attending school up to the age at which they should complete class 8. You're deprived if you don't have clean cooking fuel, adequate sanitation, safe drinking water, access to electricity, and a floor which is not dirt, sand, or natural. And you're deprived if you don't own more than one of a small set of assets: radio, television, telephone, bicycle, motorcycle, and refrigerator. So let's just bring that idea of indicators into, first of all, the Sustainable Development Goals, and recognize that as basic as they are still present in the objectives and the indicators of the SDGs. But also, let's try to see it in the life of Nahato, and I'm very grateful to Santiago Izquierdo Tort, who's a doctoral student who's on the door, and he and his companion did this case study a few weeks ago in Uganda. She's 3 years old, And her home is made of poles and bamboo, and her floor is dirt. So she's deprived in terms of flooring, puts her at risk of infectious disease. Her mum, Nambubi, is 38 years old, and she's got a total of 9 siblings, 8 elders and 1 younger. But the elder siblings dropped out of school. They couldn't pay the school fees of $275 for 4 months. So they are deprived in school attendance. And then the mum and the kids go and work, but it is a situation of food insecurity and of undernutrition. And so they have a number of indicators. And in terms of the Global MPI, if you are deprived in at least 1/3 of the dimensions, 1/3 of the weighted indicators, you're identified as poor. And so Nahato and her family are identified as multidimensionally poor. But that leaves a lot of their life out. First of all, there are additional deprivations of employment, of food security, of empowerment, of violence. There's also good things. The children are outgoing and confident. At night, sometimes they dance together to music from a radio that's shared between families because it's a tight farming community. So the MPI overlooks many things, but it does shine a piercing light on some of the deprivations that matter to her as a child. And the box shows basically the deprivation she experiences. What do we do with that? We've identified her as poor. So the first thing is to report what percentage of people are poor in Uganda. It's 70%. But she's deprived in 1/2 of the weighted indicators. On average, poor people in Uganda are weighted in 52%, are deprived in 52%, a little bit poorer than Nahato actually. When we multiply these numbers together, we get the MPI. But the important thing about it is that you can break it down, and we will trot on quickly to examples of what and how we do this. So I will hand over to Gisela to show us, in a sense, the results for this year.
Thank you, Sabina. I will first describe the data on which we base this 2017 update, and then I will present some of the findings in terms of the distribution across regions of multidimensional poverty, across income groups, a comparison with the extreme income poverty line, and also a distribution of aid across income categories. First, we present 103 countries. Half of the data sets come from the demographic and health surveys coordinated by USAID. More than a third of the survey data comes from the multiple indicators and cluster surveys coordinated by UNICEF. And 3 Pan-Arab project for family health. We use 3 of them of their surveys. We also use 6 national surveys for Brazil, China, India, Jamaica, and Ecuador, and South Africa. The reason why we only present 103 countries, despite the fact that the MPI has been estimated for 120 countries, is to maintain comparability. So for 17 countries, the data gathered in terms of multidimensional indicators was fielded before 2005. So we don't report these data together with the most recent data from 2006 to 2016 in order to maintain some sort of comparability, but the results are available online as well. And in terms of this year's update, we are updating 25 countries, 2 new countries, Algeria and El Salvador, 2 very large countries, China and India, and 2 countries that we had stopped reporting because the data was very old, which are Guatemala and Myanmar. And the data is also allow us to disaggregate by region, subnational regions and age groups this year. The quality and the frequency with which the data it's updated every year, it's also very good. In 2010, Algeria and Santos had access to 104 country data sets within the range of which the data was fielded between 2000 and the year 2000 and 2008. We actually, in this year's update, we have data that was gathered last year, and almost 3/4 of our data was gathered within the past 5 years. So it's really very, very recent data. And in terms of coverage, these 103 countries represent 5.4 billion people using population data of 2013. More than a third of them live in East Asia and the Pacific, almost a third live in South Asia, and almost a sixth live in Sub-Saharan Africa. These are the three most populous regions across the world, and we have a very good coverage, almost 94% or more of these three regions. The coverage of the population across the Arab states and Latin America is slightly lower, but it's still good. 80% of the population living in those areas is represented in the across the 103 countries that we are analyzing. We also have some good coverage for low and middle income countries. 92% of the population living in these income categories is represented by, in this sample of 103 countries. And the coverage is almost complete for low and lower middle income countries. As the main finding, we have estimated that 1.4 billion people live in multidimensional poverty. This is almost a quarter of the people, of the 5.4 billion people living in these 103 countries. As you can see, this map gives a snapshot of the findings at national level. We will see some subnational map later on in the presentation. The darkest green shows the lowest range of the multidimensional poverty index, and as the green becomes lighter, then it turns into lighter red and followed by very dark red, which indicates the largest value of the index observed in our sample of countries. You can see that the darkest red runs across the Africa, across the Sahel Desert, Niger, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Chad, Somalia are the poorest countries identified in according to the Multidimensional Poverty Index. And in terms of the income categories, using the categorization disclosed by the World Bank in July 2016, the top left pie shows the distribution of the population that we are analyzing in these 103 countries. Most of them are living in lower middle income settings, 52%, 38% live in upper middle income countries, and 10% live in low income countries. But in these low income settings, we see that 28% of those people identified as multidimensionally poor live in these low income settings. Still, 72% of those identified as multidimensionally poor live in middle income settings, which is also a striking value. And comparing the multidimensional poverty index with the extreme income poverty line, dollar a day, it's important to consider, I think, it's important to consider that only 86 countries have data for both indexes, and only for 10 of those countries, this data comes from the same year. For most of the countries, 52 countries, we have data that is more recent for the multidimensional index, and then for 24 countries, we have data, income data that is more recent in terms in terms of income poverty. it's also important to mention, as we see in the slide, that 22 countries don't have information on multidimensional poverty, but they do have information on income poverty. And most of them are located in Latin America and East Asia. The following chart attempts to compare this multidimensional poverty index with the dollar a day and a more extreme measure of poverty. So firstly, the horizontal axis aligns the 103 countries according to their multidimensional headcount ratio. So the height of the bars increases from the least poor, the country with the lowest value of headcount, multidimensional headcount ratio, which is Kazakhstan on the left. And it increases until South Sudan, which is the highest value of the multidimensional headcount ratio. The darkest red bars that are not showing very clearly in this image, but the high of the red bars shows a headcount ratio for destitution, are a measure of more extreme deprivation in the subset of people that are identified as multidimensionally poor. In addition to this, the black dots identify the headcount ratio of extreme income poverty. And we see generally the black dots lying in between the multidimensional headcount ratio, that is the orange bars, and the destitution headcount ratio. Important outliers are for instance, Uzbekistan is the far black dot that we see at the left of the image. And other countries have also very high estimates of income poverty, such as Lesotho, Swaziland, Madagascar, and Malawi, but lower estimates of multidimensional poverty. In addition to this, we analyze the distribution of overseas development assistance and official development assistance coming from the credit reporting system of the OECD, from development assistance committee countries and international organizations. This is only for priority sectors, that is the aid that targets directly those indicators that are gathered by the MPI or reflected by the MPI. Analyzing this information, we, in the 30 years previous country-specific MPI, we see that most of this source of aid, 49%, goes to lower middle income countries, but these settings agglutinate 66% or 2/3 of the multidimensional poor people. 42% goes to low income countries, and these settings have 28% of the multidimensionally poor people, and the upper middle income countries have both a lower share of ODA and a lower share of MPI poor. And this information is also thoroughly described in the leaflets that you can gather on your way out or as you come into the room. But we present some striking numbers for those countries that receive the lowest aid per poor person per year, such as India and China, receiving less than $2 per poor person in terms of multidimensional poverty, up to Madagascar, almost less than $6 per multidimensionally poor person. Now I hand over to Sabina, who will present some disaggregation of this information.
So the good news is that the Washington Group has made an agreement with the Demographic and Health Surveys that henceforth from 2017, data on disability status will be integrated into the surveys. So the Sustainable Development Goals have called for disaggregation by disability status, and it's a sign that it's getting some traction and it's moving on. So Monica Pinilla, one of our group, disaggregated a number of countries by the disability indicators in their survey. But Uganda is the survey which has the Washington group questions and could identify severe disability. So 22% of the population of Uganda live in a household in which one of their household members experiences a severe disability. And when we disaggregate the MPI according to those households, we find that it's a higher level of poverty, and that 76% of people who live in a household in which somebody has a severe disability are poor, as opposed to 69% in households without the burden of disability. This is a very first and early study, but it is a sign again that as time moves on, we will be able to disaggregate the MPI by ethnicity, by religion, disability status, and other vulnerable characteristics, again with the aim of informing actions that really support households with particularly difficult circumstances. The global MPI at the national level is like the $1.90 a day at the national level. And so you can compare them, and we can look at national statistics, we can look at changes over time, which is not our emphasis this year in our launch. But unlike $1.90 a day, you can then go subnational. And so for 78 countries, we have disaggregated the MPI by subnational regions, 988 in total. So this is Afghanistan 2015-16 data, a terribly difficult context, terribly difficult to get accurate data in the midst of a conflict. But you can see that the two red districts, Uzurgan and Nuristan, have the highest levels of poverty, with 94% and 95% of people being poor. And in Kabul, it's 25%. And so really to unwind the story of poverty, we again always have to go subnationally and look at the different levels of poverty. But only to do this so is, again, just to stay at the level of poverty. But the question is, how do you fight it? What is going on? What are the drivers of poverty? And so let's go to Myanmar with 2016 data. Myanmar, on average, 30% of people are poor. But in the Rakhine state, it's 52%. And of course, Rakhine is the state home to the Rohingya, who are much in the news, but it's also a state home to many poor Buddhists as well. So it's a much higher level of poverty. So one of the features of the global MPI is you can break it down by indicator. So in the colored graphic, the stripy bars, the height of it is the level of MPI. And the height of each stripe within it is the weighted contribution of each indicator to poverty in Myanmar. And so at a glance, you can see stripe is malnutrition. So that is a big contributor to poverty in Myanmar, whereas the thin green one is assets poverty, which is rather low. So you can understand a little bit of the configuration. But when we look in Myanmar and we compare the Rakhine, which is on the left, with the national on the right, we see the levels of deprivation in most indicators are double, whether it's nutrition deprivations or years of schooling or children out of school. But the pattern is quite similar. And so if you were thinking of allocating budget, or if you were thinking of working with the ministries, there's not a different story to tell. But let's go now to Chad. Chad, using 2015 data, has 87% of its population in poverty. The poorest subnational region among all studied is in Chad. In fact, in 4 of the subnational regions of Chad, 98 or 99% of people are poor. So let's look at Lak and Wadi Fira, which each have 98 or 99% of the population living in MPI poverty. And we would think that, in a sense, that's where the story stops. You can't get any more relevant information. But the bar chart shows each of the 10 indicators. And of course, this has been a terrible time of drought that's affected some of the regions. And so in Wadi Fira, 97% of people at the moment do not have access, or in 2015, did not have access to safe drinking water. Whereas in Lak, it was 60%, which is high still, but quite different. And in Lak, you see that the health deprivations of malnutrition and of child mortality were much, much higher. Again, because of the food insecurity there. And so pulling the MPI apart by subnational region, and then looking across the composition of poverty can bring out stories that you can compare. We've focused now on comparisons within countries, but actually where a lot of the interest is comparison across national borders. Punjab, India with Punjab, Pakistan. West Bengal with Bangladesh, neighboring regions. But each country wants and is curious about the level and the composition of poverty just across the border. And we're hoping that this kind of analysis, which is not possible with national MPIs, can spur a constructive competition between countries to fight it. And so that's why we have done this for 988 regions, and we hope to break 1,000 in December. And they are also decomposed by rural and by urban areas to bring the full picture. So that's some of our findings. The report has more. It has findings on the 700+ million people who are destitute. More destitutes live in India than in the continent of sub-Saharan Africa, more in Pakistan than in the region of East Asia and Pacific, or in the region of Arab states. So there's a lot to learn about destitution, which hopefully will incentivize action. But I'd like to simply close now, and to close with the closing words of Sir Tony Atkinson's Commission report. It's both to recognize the limitations of measurement, which are descriptive, not analytical, which are quantitative, not qualitative, if you're an anthropologist, which are limited by the amount of data that we have across 100 countries, which doesn't include some things, but perhaps it can contribute. The estimation of the extent of global poverty is an exercise in description. As Amartya Sen wrote, description as an intellectual activity is typically not regarded as very challenging. But he goes on to say, description isn't just observing and reporting. It involves the exercise, possibly difficult, of selection. Description can be characterized as choosing from the set of possibly true statements on a subset on grounds of their relevance. Understanding the choices underlying the monitoring indicators and their full implications is challenging. There will doubtless be differences of views, but it is hoped that the ensuing debate will bring together all those concerned and provide a basis for action to tackle one of the gravest problems facing the world today. So our hope in doing a global MPI is not to have the final say on measurement. We will disagree with each other and with our colleagues, and we will learn from those disagreements. And it's not to have the perfect measure of poverty, but it's to have one that is a tool in the hand of others to act against this very grave problem. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much indeed.